I hereby would like to welcome you all in today's conversation, Imagining Justice Through Oral History with Zoe West. I'm sure you're all eager to hear what Zoe has to say, but before that I wanted to take a short period and just do a brief introduction and pass the mic over to her. In a world ruled by the notion that history is written by the victors, I believe that oral history provides a heaven for collective memory. Whereas conventional history, written history of the so-called masters per se, is static, oral history can provide a dynamic and fluid alternative. It often provides us with the alternate story, the other history, and the candid records of the people as they themselves experience the events. I find that it also can run the risk of being buried in fantastic tall tales and myths, fables and lore, but when properly researched, there often comes up an event behind these myths with such strong marks in the collective memory of the people that the lesson still rings true. Plus, we find at times it may provide us with patches of stories from before there ever was any tangible means of archiving, such as petroglyphs, hieroglyphs, the cuneiform, and the written word as we know it now. Before I started working with groups of people who own rich oral histories in different parts of the globe, I used to be mesmerized by folk tales. In fact, I own a large collection of folk tales and fables and fairy tales still in my cupboard in my library at home. And I still make use of them in my researches, especially books on mythology, trying to understand a certain group of people in history, in a certain geography, before I set out there to actually get to know them in person. Working with people in conflict and post-conflict zones and hearing their stories of a more recent past, I often question these books that I own. Can they be true, buried in layers of symbolism? Are they in fact telling us of not the witches, the giants, the monsters, but of humanity itself? When I was visually documenting and writing my first book, Illegal, which was recently mentioned, and it tells the story of two African women trying to survive in Istanbul, one from Somalia, Suad, the other one from Ethiopia, Zimbabwe. I heard many stories from them on our many days throughout the 3 years that we spent together. Stories of their flight, their arrival in Turkey, the smugglers, the ships crossing the Mediterranean, which port they thought they were left at, and so on. In a conversation one day with Suad, she told me that the captain of the ship smuggling them from Somalia had actually dumped them off the shore from the Mediterranean down in the south coast of Turkey, a few sea miles off, and that they had to swim over to shore, and that she could actually manage to do that swim because she had learned to swim in Somalia in the river Wabi Shebele in Beledweyne, where she was from, daring the alligators that were that were found in this river. Years later, as I traveled to eastern Chad to document the plight of the people from Darfur, which culminated in my second book, West End of the Border, I met a Frenchman who in fact had spent a considerable amount of time in Beledweyne. His wife was from there. I asked him about the alligators in the Wabi Shebele River, which Suad had claimed that she had learned how to swim. I knew that she had told me this story so that she could see the shock in my face, but I just still wanted to verify. He told me that there were no alligators in Wabi Shebele. There never had been. His wife was from there. He had spent a considerable amount of time in the region. Now, Suad loved telling a good story. Like I said, she must have loved the idea that she learned to swim braving the crocodile-filled river of Beledweyne. She must have loved to see the shock she inflicted upon me as she told her story, but I never took anything she told me with a grain of salt. I knew there was some truth in it, so I dug. One of these intense diggings ended up saving her life, reopening her case with the UNHCR so she could claim her refugee status here in Turkey, but that's a story for another time. For now, let's go back to the alligators she swam with. The Wadi Shebele River has a diverse and sensitive wildlife, but the Somali wildlife is really understudied. It has been historically known to host the area, one of the main crocodile species that is widely dispersed throughout Africa, the Nile crocodile. And we know from Samuel Baker's written work from 1868 that there were crocodiles in Sudan which were widely hunted, despite what my French friend said about Somalia, we also know from Arthur Donaldson Smith's book, Through Unknown African Countries, written in 1897, that there were crocodiles in Somalia along the Shabelle River basin near Barire, even though there is none now. Barire is down the river from Beledweyne. Now, Beledweyne is north, near the Ethiopian-Somali border, and northwest from Ethiopia is Sudan, where we know the crocodiles were hunted some 30 years before when Smith wrote this book in 1868. However, Ethiopia built a series of dams on Wadi Shabelle, on the Shabelle River basin. These are known as Genale dams, and these dams block large fish and amphibians from following their path, the water path down south. So these dams were built in 1926, and that is probably why my French friend never saw any alligators in Beledweyne, and possibly neither did his wife, both of them being born in 1960s. So what Swat had been telling me must have been patchy remains of her people's oral history, maybe her grandmother's or her nene's, mixed with her troubled memories. And the more I thought of it afterwards, I realized that maybe Swat wanted to share this story with me as it reminded her of her happier times, her youth, when she heard this story as a child, when her father had not yet been killed by a car bomb and her mom had not yet lost her mind, when her grandmother was still alive and was telling her stories about the alligators in Wadi Shabelle, and when all was not yet lost. So the alligator part in Swat's story was true, except it belonged to a different time. And just the mere mention of it is a gem for us researchers on a different level. Those of us who are interested in researching ecosystem migrations, habitat loss, biodiversity at the present time. Now, I will leave you with a short passage from my last book, Standing Rock, before like I promised, I hand over to Zoe, in which I detail the resistance against a major crude oil pipeline crossing the treaty lands of the Lakota tribe in the United States. From this passage, you will hear some words from one of the most prominent oral history keepers of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Ladonna Tamakawastewi Nallard, someone who was born into a culture of oral history and someone who makes sure today that that culture still survives. The passage reads as such. Native American history, as with all oral history, is the challenging area for journalists, us, to conduct research in. By professional definition, we're pushed to bend over backwards to tell all stories, all sides of a story based on hard fact. However, when one side experiences have been meticulously documented and survived, while the other side memories have largely gone missing, it is near impossible to get down to the origins of a story and reconstruct reality. That ominous Winston Churchill quote, "History is written by the victors," perpetually breathes down our necks. So on that day in the Prairie Knights Casino at Fort Yates, when I told Ladonna that I couldn't find a written reference to the Black Snake prophecy, this was the prophecy that kept on running through the Standing Rock protests, anywhere, she said, smiling, that it was because there was none. Because it must stay oral. Because we put it into writing, then it becomes a lie. Because American language is up for interpretation. You can't even remember what your Bible said originally. You fight out over the interpretations. So when you put it into written word, it becomes a lie. Sometimes keeping a story alive can have a powerful means of attaining a different type of justice, as we say in Turkish, divine justice. And at times, remembering can in fact help heal, especially when the memory of a new generation has been the construct of a colonial mind, as the Lakota like to say. Remembering their Lakota ways often brings closure for most of them. Oral history can serve as a reminder of an identity lost for people who have been torn by assimilation, yet never quite assimilated. With these thoughts, I introduce you today Zoe West, an anthropologist and an oral historian. She's also a keeper of stories. Zoe is adjunct faculty in the Oral History Master of Arts, Columbia University, and the Harry von Arsdale Jr. Center for Labor Studies, SUNY Empire State College. She's also a founding member of Riza Collective, which as a women-led collective uses storytelling, healing, organizing, and research to support social transformation and environmental justice. And last but not least, Zoe is the co-editor of the oral history collection Nowhere to Be Home, Narratives from Survivors of Burma's Military Regime, which came out in 2016. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Bikem. I think that starts us on a humbling note, the words of La Donna, to be humbled by the kind of multiple ideas of truth and memory that we encounter when we start to think about oral history. So I'm really grateful to be here and to everyone here. I'm very grateful to the Hrant Dink Foundation and the Columbia Columbia Global Center at Istanbul for hosting this talk, and to Bikem for joining me here to draw connections between all of this work. And I'm very grateful also to my colleagues back home who've helped me continuously think through all of the issues that I'll be speaking about today. So I want us to start off just by thinking about, when I speak about oral history today, I'm speaking mainly about the field of oral history interviewing. And as a field of long-form biographical interviews that is centered on a kind of bottom-up idea of history, at least in the tradition that I do it, and interviewing people who have directly experienced history as it's unfolding. And so I wanted to start us off by thinking about two core principles of this field and how they help us think about the possibilities of using oral history interviews as a way of hearing better and understanding the experience of survivors and people who've directly experienced oppression and violence, and being able to better understand what justice and liberation would look like. So the first one that I have up here is collaboration and sharing authority. So this is, these are principles that we speak about a lot in this field in the sense of oral history as a type of interview where the agency of the narrator, that is the person being interviewed, is front and center, and they are determining what is most important to tell. So this is in contrast to, say, testimony in a court of law, or sometimes even testimony in a truth commission, or different forms of interviews where it is the interviewer or the attorney or the people who have the authority to determine what is worth telling, what is important to hear. So in contrast to when we do oral history interviewing, we are attempting to put at the center the agency of the person who is narrating the story to determine what is important, and that is both during the interview as well as afterwards, for example, in the practice of sharing the interview transcript or the interview recording with the person and having them approve it, having them transfer ownership of it to the archive, or having them approve the narrative for publication, etc. So this means of sharing the authority of the interview and collaborating at multiple levels between the interviewer and the interviewee. The second principle that I have here is deep listening, which I think people use this in different ways, but there's one definition that I wanted to read from Sheftel and Zembrzycki, where they define deep listening as listening for meanings, not facts, and listening in such a way that prompts more profound reflection from the interviewee, and I would add in from the interviewer. And so when we think about deep listening in the context of narratives about oppression and narratives about violence, it calls on us to be able to listen to more complex, difficult to hear narratives, to be able to open up to multiple narratives that might have, on the surface, that might contradict each other or that might tell different stories, and to understand what this tells us about collective memory, about individual subjective experiences within political and social structures, about what this tells us about the experience and the impact of injustice and the impact of oppression and violence. So as oral historians, we're always striving to be capable of deeply listening and to be able to hear, maybe in line with what the story Bikem was telling before, to be able to hear the multiple layers of a story, to be able to hear the roots of where this is coming within cultural and social and political memory. So I want to start us from that frame as we think about what it is about oral history that might be useful when we think about struggling for justice and for liberation. So oral history, I would argue, can be a powerful means of documenting human rights abuses, oppression, and conflict from the bottom up. So to potentially open up the space for people and narratives that have been marginalized, that have been silenced often, and to allow them to challenge official narratives and to complicate narrow accounts of conflict and oppression. The goals of oral history for justice can be diverse. They can be for filling in gaps in the historical record, so different forms of documentation, for using these narratives as a form of looking for justice or reparations. It can be memorialization and different forms of healing. And it can also be toward reconciliation in post-conflict situations. And the commitment to these kinds of long-form life narrative interviews and archival presentation and the voicing the experience of people who are directly impacted allows us to situate conflict and injustice within this broader context, both within the broader context of an entire life rather than just narrowly looking at the bad thing that happened to someone and defining someone as a victim, defining a refugee as someone who is just that label and is just defined by the bad thing that happened to them. But rather to understand that in the context of a life and to understand that in the context of a broader historical trajectory, a cultural and political setting. And so really I think that oral history offers us a really powerful opportunity to be able to situate people's subjective experience within these larger structural, social, and historical contexts. And so I would say that in my experience in the work that I do, oral history is one channel for doing this. In my work with Riza Collective, for example, we think a lot about this framing. We have this term we've been using, regenerative organizing, for thinking about the ways that when we are working toward justice and liberation, we can't only be working to transform oppressive systems and structures, but we must also grapple with the impacts of these systems and structures on, that these have had on us, within us as individuals, between us, within our communities, and within our movements. And therefore, to understand how the impact of trauma, individual trauma, collective trauma, generational trauma, the impacts of trauma and the impacts of oppression, how they shape us. And to understand that even when we are successful in shifting these systems and shifting systems of oppression and exploitation, we can't, that doesn't erase the impression and the impact of these systems on us. And that we have to tend to both elements and be able to work in both channels. And also that when we are able to hear and witness and recognize the impact of oppression and injustice and violence, that this allows us to put this experience at the center of how we envision what justice looks like, how we envision what it means to move forward. And so today I want to argue for the value of oral history as one channel for doing this work, one channel that has to exist alongside different forms of organizing and justice and advocacy work. So one of the, a concept that has really been valuable to me in thinking through the possibilities of oral history in this realm, I want to introduce this concept from Jill Stauffer, who's a scholar at Haverford University, or Haverford College. And she wrote a book called Ethical Loneliness that came out a couple years ago. And I met Jill originally because she's on the board of Voice of Witness, who published my book on oral histories of life under Burma or Myanmar's military regime. And so Jill is on the board of Voice of Witnesses, was how I originally met her. And she put out this book, Ethical Loneliness, and as I was preparing, developing a new course on oral history and human rights, I sat down to read her book, and in fact, it's not a book about oral history interviews, but I found it to be a really valuable lens for thinking through why it is that it's so critical to open up possibilities for hearing better, for being able to better hear toward justice. So Jill Stauffer defines ethical loneliness as the isolation one feels when, as a violated person or as a member of a persecuted group, one has been abandoned by humanity or by those who have power over one's life possibilities. It's a condition undergone by persons who have been unjustly treated and dehumanized by human beings and political structures, who emerge from that injustice only to find that the surrounding world will not listen to or cannot properly hear their testimony, their claims about what they suffered and about what is now owed them on their own terms. So, ethical loneliness is the experience of having been abandoned by humanity, compounded by the experience of not being heard. Such loneliness is so named because it is a form of social abandonment that can be imposed only by multiple ethical lapses on the part of human beings who are residing in the surrounding world. So I read a full definition because I think that actually this concept of ethical loneliness brings up multiple forms of what it is that we need to be listening for when we are trying to hear better. And so when we're thinking about the ways that a court of law or that even the media and various forms where narratives might be told, that even when narratives about suffering are told, that there might be constrained space in which they are heard, and that we can't fully hear survivors on their own terms. And so, right, there's two levels. Sometimes the narratives aren't even given any space at all. And so we see that in multiple political situations where they're not given any attention in the media or in the public realm, or that the suffering of certain groups is silenced and it's not allowed to be spoken. So there's that level of silencing. Or there's also the level of that when there is space given to narratives, that sometimes they're only allowed to be heard or people are only able to hear them in a certain narrow way. And so the concept of ethical loneliness, I think, challenges us to try to learn what it means to hear better, to be able to better hear the experience and the needs of survivors, to better hear the impact of suffering and what that means when we try to imagine justice. So I'm going to shortly I will get into a couple examples of oral histories because I would rather, I think it's I don't want to be ironic and speak about oral history and not show any examples of oral history. And then maybe you can also hear other voices other than mine. And so before we get into some examples, I have here just a few channels that I want us to think about as we bring in these different framings that I've just spoken about ethical loneliness, deep listening, sharing authority, regenerative activism. So when we're listening to oral histories, I think we can think about first the experience of hearing that happens in the space of the interview itself. So I think we have probably multiple people in the room, many people in the room who do interviews, who do this kind of work. And whether you've been on the side of being the interviewer or the interviewee, that you can attest to in these kinds of interviews, when there's actually deep listening and sharing authority and collaboration happening, that it can be a profound space for hearing in more depth and a profound space for witnessing and recognizing the experience of survivors. And then at the next level, we think about what I was just mentioning before, the hearing of interviews and of narratives and testimony more widely. So to have these testimonies recognized in the broader social realm. And we'll speak more about this, but of course with the understanding that politics and power can really limit what stories can be heard, and that this is something we're always coming up against, is how do we challenge the constraints and the limitations that are put on what stories are allowed to be heard in the public realm. And finally, the last one that I want to bring attention to is that the ways that we can hear through understanding these subjective experiences in their broader context, that we can have a greater understanding of root causes and a greater understanding of the impacts of suffering in a way, as I said before, that allows us to reimagine what justice, what repair, or what reconciliation might look like. So the first case study that I want to introduce is a project that comes out of El Salvador, and it's called Unfinished Sentences. So this is an oral history project that is about the civil war in El Salvador, and the civil war that happened in the 1980s. And the context is that this project began more than 10 years, or roughly 10 years after the conflict had ended, after the Salvadoran Civil War had ended. And it's a very local initiative in a community called Arquetao. And there was a committee of historical memory in this community. And the committee convened and decided that they wanted to preserve the memories of this community in a way that the National Truth Commission and these more official spaces for sharing testimony, they felt that they hadn't been heard in these spaces and that their experience was not reflected adequately. And so they decided to do this grassroots initiative. And so there was the Historical Memory Committee of Arquetao, as well as they collaborated. They brought in people from the Human Rights Institute at the Central American University of Jose Simeon Cañas, as well as the University of Washington in the US, the Human Rights Center. And so this was a collaboration that had multiple goals. They wanted to create a book. This was very important to the people in the community, to create a book that would share with their community members, with the youth, their experience of what happened both in the Civil War and when they had to flee to Honduras before coming back. And they wanted to create a book. They created an archive of video interviews, which I'll show you 2 brief ones. And they also, this was part of other initiatives that included pushing for the bodies of people who had been killed to be exhumed and to create a community sanctuary for the burial and for community members to be able to convene that honored the people killed in the conflict, as well as a museum locally. So I say this to show that often these projects of oral history or these memory projects have many different outputs and many different channels through which they're understanding the need to preserve historical memory and to bring to life the experience of survivors and the people who directly experienced it. So let me start one of the clips. The first clip is a woman named Margarita who is speaking about the reasons that she's talking about the root causes before the Civil War of why people began to organize and why they began to organize in resistance to the government and to the conditions that they were facing. It's in Spanish with English subtitles.
Para usted, ¿por qué la gente se empezó a organizar? Bueno, porque había una necesidad, porque ya no teníamos tierra para trabajar, cada día era más difícil para comprar la canasta básica, por ejemplo, ¿verdad? Y el que no trabaja, no es profesional, claro, solo de trabajar la tierra tampoco no tiene una vida bien difícil, ¿verdad? Entonces, yo creo que fue el factor que los llevó a organizarlos, ¿verdad? Ya que cuando se iban las cortes de café, también le explotaban a uno tanto que una tortilla que le daban como que si era una mascota, ¿verdad? Y chancla y con frijoles ahí nomás y hasta ratones muertos en los frijoles que salían ahí. Entonces, y ellos cada vez haciéndose más ricos y nosotros aguantando frío, aguantando hambre, qué sé yo, y comiendo una comida de que no era digna, ¿verdad? Entonces yo creo que todo eso nos llevó a organizarlo para que esas cosas cambiaran.
And so I'm just going to jump right to the next one, which is a woman named Berta, who is explaining why she didn't leave with the rest of her family to go to Honduras as a refugee, and the experience of staying behind in El Salvador during the wartime.
No, yo no quise, me decía, Berta, vamos. Y fíjese que yo, como usted sabe que uno no andaba como en su casa, que yo tenía ropa. Y yo cuando se fue mi nuera, que andaba así, que iba a tener bicho, se fue para las mesas. Yo le daba la razón porque con la gran barriga no podía andar. Pues me habían dejado, le miento, no, aquí tuvo el chino ella, en Jaguataya, y me dejaron un pedacito como de tricot, porque no tenía ni con qué taparme. Y mire, Paco, ni porque iba a estar allá, que allá le daban ropa y de todo, y me llevé el chilingo que yo me tapaba, y yo quedé sin nada con él para taparme. Pues y se fue a estar allá un año. Mire, se fue Paco para las mesas, se fue el papá de él, se fue Alexander, el papá de la Roxana, pero que allá estuvieron todos ellos, mi tío Pedro y el papá de Paco. Mire, allá le daban de todo, carpetas, tejas negras, mire, nadie fue uno de mandarme siquiera para que se tape para una tormenta. Y a la María, con la hermana mía, y con mi tío Pedro vivía ahí, le mandaban cortes, le mandaban los grandes pedazos de negro, y yo allí con esa otra nueva que tuvo el niño ahí en el campo, es por Nueva Trinidad. Allí tuvo el niño sin ni pañales, ni nada. Pues a ese día el hijo mío le mandaban para cabañas. No, le dijo yo, no me voy, porque mi mamá andaba, ella solita, le dijo. No se quiso ir para cabañas a cuidar la jarabonda, porque yo solo andaba.
Y miren,
¿sí?
¿Y usted por qué decidió quedarse? ¿Por qué no decidió?
¿Sabe por qué no estoy firme? Porque me decía Paco, Berta, vámonos. Nosotros le podemos estorbar a los hipotes, ¿no? Para que combatan. No creo que les haga estorbo. No me quise ir. El ciudad estuvo un año. Alexander, el papá de la Roxana también. La mamá, la Arminda. Todas ellas, yo no quise ir.
¿Por sus hijos?
Sí, pues ahí le dije yo, mira Paco, yo no me voy a ver por qué les puede pasar algo a mis hijos y yo voy a quedar con aquellos que no les he visto. No me voy, no me quise ir. Él se estuvo allá un año. Y mira cómo es que allá les sobrara cosas que les daban. No fueron dignos ni mi tío Tello suegro de mandarme aunque sea un chirajo para taparme, o un nylon.
So I played those two clips because first in Margaritas, I think
Y allí en la virtud pues era muy difícil, ¿verdad? Porque la situación, la amontonazón de gente.
I will say that actually there's many of these short videos on the website for unfinished sentences. So I really recommend people look, if you go to unfinishedsentences.org, you can see a lot more about the whole project. So Margarita's, that short excerpt, I think, helps us remember to be able to draw the connections back to the root causes, and to not only focus on the harm that was experienced, say, in the Civil War and the death, the killing, the injury, the repression that was experienced during the Civil War, but also the experiences of oppression and exploitation that gave birth to the reason that Civil War happened, and to really be able to understand these multiple levels and these root causes of experiences of harm and oppression in order to have this broader frame that actually gives us a much deeper understanding of conflict, and therefore a much deeper understanding of what actually it would look like to have justice and to move forward. And so I have Margarita's there for that reason. And in Berta's clip, I think it's an interesting one because I think, I don't know if you have the same experience, but the first time I heard it, I felt a little unsettled because the harm she fixates on most in this excerpt is the indignity of her family not sending things back to her when she stayed behind, that they went to the refugee camps and they got supplies and nobody thought to send her back anything, and that she was left alone and she felt really abandoned, right? And it's clearly a source of harm. She brings it up multiple times in this clip, and the reason I draw attention to that is because I think actually very often in a lot of narratives in oral histories about experiences of conflict and oppression, it's not uncommon to hear narratives that really express an enduring sense of pain or a sense of abandonment, not only from those who we more traditionally think of as the perpetrators. So in this case, for example, the government army, which committed the vast majority of the killing in the Civil War, but also to understand the ways that people experience this harm and at the level of like family and close relations. And so what does this tell us? It doesn't, it's not, what I'm trying to say is not that Berta wants punishment to fall upon her family, or that she thinks that justice means her family suffering or having retribution for not sending her things. No, I think what it tells us is that the way that larger systems of oppression and violence and larger contexts of violence and conflict create the conditions that that really rupture a sense of being able to rely upon others, that rupture a sense of connection, rupture a sense of being able to rely on the world around you. And I think this is actually really important for us to pay attention to when we're imagining justice, when we're imagining moving forward. And this ties into the kind of underpinning concept of ethical loneliness, because one of the things that Jill Stauffer emphasizes in thinking about this idea of ethical loneliness is that it really shows us how ourselves are collectively formed, and therefore our autonomy, our idea of being autonomous selves is actually very dependent on other people, and on other people respecting our boundaries or respecting our humanity. And that this is made very clear when you have the experience of being abandoned by humanity. And this can be through great harm, violence, mass oppression. And so I think that when we think about this, and we think about Berta's experience of feeling abandoned by her family, And of course she knows, and if you look at other parts of her testimony, she knows and she speaks a lot to the ways that her sons were fighting in the resistance, and that's why she stayed behind to stay there with her sons, but also that she experienced directly government massacres, government army massacres. So it's not that she's pushing aside this larger structural critique and point where she's pointing to the injustices done, but that I think that when we think about the pain that endures and how do you rebuild a world, this is a concept that is tied to the ethical loneliness concept. How do you rebuild a world when people experience it as their world having been destroyed? And I think that these kind of complicated testimonies about harm can help us understand the impacts of conflict and the impacts of oppression and how they often reverberate through multiple levels of social and family and close relationships. And this is the way that people experience it very acutely, and therefore we have to attend to that experience when we try to imagine justice. There's a book and a project about the Asaba Memorial Project out of in Nigeria, and this is about the Asaba massacre. And I bring this up because there's testimonies in this project also that make me think of the same thing, where people talk about how the war set off this kind of spiral of people having declining conditions, where families, many of the heads of families were killed, and so the families suddenly didn't have the funds. The children could no longer go to school. They were impoverished, and the ways that this kind of set off this rippling of effects that impacted the community in the generations to come, and that people then, like rifts in families developing because of these impacts that were set off by the massacre. And so, for example, there's a story of Emeka who recounts the story of after the massacre and after losing family and their family becoming impoverished, was in school and couldn't afford like a very small amount of money to buy the handout that was required for a course, and just harped and very much like goes on about the not being able to forget the shame and the pain of this embarrassment of ending up also having to drop out of school, and of being able to realize that they couldn't afford this simple handout. And this seems, right, when we're talking about the context of a massacre of people being killed, this seems like a very sort of strange point to harp on, but I think it reflects these multiple levels of which people experience these spiraling effects of violence and structural oppression, and the ways that harm gets experienced at these multiple levels, and what it tells us about how justice and repair can be pursued, that it's not enough to, say, pursue the perpetrators in a court of law. That alone will not honor the people who are lost. That will not restore the indignities that have rippled out from these original harms and the ways that they have had expanding impacts at multiple levels of society and family. So I think we can see this in a lot of different oral history projects and a lot of different narrative and memorial projects, that they help us see multiple levels of harm and have a more complicated understanding of the ways that responsibility really falls much more broadly and collectively in seeking repair, and having this really much more expansive idea of who is responsible for partaking in that repair, and hearing the experience of survivors and hearing what is required, and to be able to think about that and to think of justice beyond like the narrow confines of, say, legal ideas of who is responsible for harm. So the next example that I want to give is from the book that I co-edited with Maggie Lemire, which is called Nowhere to Be Home: Narratives from Survivors of Burma's Military Regime. And this was it was a team effort. It was a collective project of collecting oral history narratives in a number of different countries, both in Myanmar/Burma, but more so in neighboring countries, because at that time, the original book was published in 2011, and then the other image you see is of the Burmese translation, which was published in 2016. When we originally worked on the book, the political context was such that it was very dangerous for people inside Burma to do an interview about their life experiences and human rights under the military regime, which is why the majority of the interviews we did in neighboring countries with people who had fled. Right after the book was published, actually, there were elections for the first time in a long time, and although many things have not actually changed that much, certain things have, and one thing is that the censorship board was disbanded in this space for people can speak more openly about things without the kind of broad and immediate experiences of being imprisoned or detained for speaking out. And so that's why we were able to partner with a Burmese publisher more recently to publish the Burmese edition. So the original one was published in the US. And so I want to just also draw that distinction that, for example, the El Salvador project was had the audience both of the community. Many of the outputs were for that community in El Salvador and to preserve historical memory there. But then the website was also directed towards a more broader audience, an international audience. And that was done by the time the book for that project came out, and the website, and it was, I think, more than 20 years after the conflict had ended. Versus here with this project, we were, when we were working on it, the military regime was still in power, and it was also the book was originally published in the U.S., so there was an international audience, and the second one was an audience within Burma. And so I think we have to think about these different purposes and what can be accomplished by narrative and oral history projects when they exist at different moments of, as far as like how close they are to the conflict in time, at what level they're operating, how local, how national or international. And so I want to just read you one very short excerpt of a narrative from this that I think also speaks to these kind of multiple levels of harm and suffering, and to help pushes us to think about the how do we situate subjective experiences of injustice within a larger context. So this is the story of a man named Ko Mong Mong, who we interviewed in Malaysia. He had fled, and the background to his story is that he had fled Burma originally because he was looking for work, because in Burma his family suffered immense poverty, but also forced labor was very common in the region in which they lived, and so people from the community would be forced by the military to work on various types of projects, or to do portering for the military, which both could be very dangerous, but also broadly was economically meant that when you were doing forced labor, you weren't earning an income for your family. And so there were these different levels of exploitation and injustice that were happening that pushed him originally to migrate. And he ended up being trafficked into the fishing industry in Southeast Asia, which is, I won't get into in detail, but the fishing industry in Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia is very notoriously violent and exploitative. There's a lot of basically slavery and trafficking happening. And so he ended up falling into the hands of traffickers and spent years working for little to no pay and working under violent and abusive conditions on fishing boats until he was able and tried to escape multiple times and was finally able to escape into Malaysia. And so we interviewed him in Kuala Lumpur. And at the time that we interviewed him, he had learned that he was HIV positive and he had pneumonia. And so he was had written down part of his life story because he wanted us to read that first, because he knew that he would have to limit his speaking because of the pneumonia. And so towards the end of the interview, he was speaking about his experience now and his experience since finding out that he was HIV positive. And he said, "I can't do any job now because of the pneumonia. If I speak too much or walk for a short distance, I feel so tired. I've had pneumonia in the lower airway many times. It's very closely related to asthma. I take 2 tablets a day of the HIV drug. That's 60 tablets a month. I didn't tell any of my acquaintances or my friends that I have the disease. 1 or 2 of my friends have called me to visit their homes, but I told them I couldn't go. I gave some excuse. I feel so much shame, and I don't want them to worry for me. Since I got HIV, I've had no contact with Ong So, my best friend. He doesn't know that I have HIV, and we haven't been in contact since last year, I think. I don't want to go back to Burma now, because if I went back, I would have to tell my parents that I have the disease, and I feel so much shame. I don't want them to see that I have HIV. I now regret and grieve so much. Before, when I had a little bit of money, I used to find happiness with beer and girls or that kind of thing. Maybe that's how I got the disease. I really have so much regret, because I've had so many bad experiences in my life. I'm not sure anymore how to decide if a person can be trusted or not. A friend is someone who, even if they have only one thing, they'll give it to their friend. A friend never takes. So I don't know who to trust anymore. I want to feed and support my family before they die. I want to find them, and I'm always thinking about how to support them. It's in my mind every day. Now my biggest desire is to be cured so I can support my parents. I want freedom from the disease." So I read this excerpt because Koh Mong Mong had experienced really very many forms of injustice and violence throughout his life and exploitation. And as we were speaking, he spoke a lot about the pain of feeling abandoned, of the experience of being an undocumented migrant because he didn't have official refugee status, to having very limited access to health care, to basically a self-imposed exile because of the social stigma, the shame surrounding having HIV, the ways that these multiple levels of indignity have subverted him from his, goes back to this like very original desire, which was leaving the country to be able to support his parents. And then all of these different levels that undid that possibility, and the ways that he experiences this as multiple forms of shame and abandonment and self-imposed exile. And I think it really tells us a lot about how we have to understand these as subjective experiences of harm and injustice and be able to connect them to these larger structural and systemic conditions that have created it. So to trace this wider web of responsibility, in this case, it's not only the traffickers who sold Koh Mong Mong. It's not just the boat captains who were violent with him and shockingly exploitative. It's not just the Burmese couple he met who sold him again. It's also the entrenched conditions of poverty, the economic inequality in Burma, in the world, the military government's repression and exploitation, all of these that spurred his migration into the hands of traffickers, into fishing boats, and that allowed this pain and indignity of that he's experienced at multiple levels to unfold. And so I bring us back to this original concept of ethical loneliness and the multiple levels of hearing, and the ways that I think we can begin to listen to the direct experiences and the complex narratives of people who've directly experienced injustice and oppression, and to allow that to both to push us to hear complicated experiences of harm that challenge us to conceive much more widely of our collective responsibility to push for repair and to understand what repair and justice would look like. And also to have a much more complex understanding of how these impacts of injustice and oppression fit within these larger structural conditions, and what that means for the changes and transformations that need to happen in order to create conditions in which justice is possible, in which ethical loneliness, this experience of having experienced grave harm and then not being heard, that we can overcome conditions of ethical loneliness, and be able to better imagine justice and to witness and recognize harm so that we can imagine repair. I wanted to also just show this photo briefly. This is another narrator from our book on Burma, whose name is Nono, and he passed away in 2015. Very sadly, he was an incredible activist, human rights activist, and LGBTQ activist who was really showed. His narrative also shows these multiple levels of experience of as an internally displaced person. His father was a general in an opposition army in Burma, and he experienced also the kind of various levels of being gay and experiencing human rights abuses from the military, experiencing the challenges of not feeling able to be who he was with his father, who was a general, and all these kind of multiple levels that sparked his activism and that really informed his vision of what it meant to push for justice in Burma. And so I just want to invoke his memory as we think about complex visions of justice. So to end, I just want to end with a few thoughts on the kind of broader politics of memory and narrative work. I think when we speak about these kinds of projects about oral history or memory projects about oppression and injustice and conflict, it's always with, it has to always be with the knowledge that the power dynamics and political context in which they exist is very real. And there's a lot of ways that this constrains what narratives can be heard, right? And the ways that this constrains the possibilities of seeking justice in multiple forms. And so we're always working within this knowledge and within these constraints to push for how do we steadily undo these limitations and undo these constraints in order to be able to create space for narratives and for these histories from the bottom up to actually have more space to be heard beyond the existing power dynamics. And what we see in a lot of different places, from Guatemala to South Africa to Ireland to El Salvador, is that very often a lot of these oral history projects emerge from the grassroots, and sometimes they emerge after maybe space has been opened up by larger political processes, organizing, activism, truth commissions, international justice court cases. Sometimes in response to those, there will be grassroots recognition that they're not actually being heard adequately, and that they want to open up space for their direct experience to inform our understanding of the harm that has been experienced and the justice that is owed. And so I'm going to end there to allow, I think there are probably a lot of people here who have a lot of experience that speaks to these different threads, and so I'm very curious to hear how these different frames resonate or don't with your own experience and with Bikem's experience.
Thank you, Zoe. Is this on? Well, that's Zoe, so if you want to give her an applause.